Before I get started, I wanted to share with you, I'm having some issues with my technology, so I'm going to turn my video off, but I wanted to say hi to you first before I went off video. So hello, really great to have all of you join us today. Thank you to all our friends who are on this call, both new and old. For some of you who may not know about Thousand Currents, the organization that's organizing this webinar, we are a public foundation that supports grassroots groups and social movements working at the intersections of food sovereignty, climate justice, and alternative economies. Our partners are led by Indigenous peoples, women, and young people. And we have partners in parts of Africa, Asia and the Pacific, and Latin America. We are so moved and inspired by the interest in this conversation, as evidenced by all of you who are on this call today. Several weeks ago, as we saw the pandemic expand from one country to another, our team started to be concerned and alarmed about its potentially devastating impact on our partners and their communities. While we are all susceptible to the virus, the impact is not carried equally, as we know. And we know that it's a grave and urgent public health concern. And yet at the same time, we know that its causes, impact, and solutions are also economic, political, and social. Particularly in the places where Thousand Currents has partners, the compounded effects from the likes of imperialism, extractivism, authoritarianism, limited public welfare and healthcare infrastructures, and endemic inequality create fertile ground for a pandemic like this to worsen existing inequities and injustices, as we are seeing today by how women, how Black people, Indigenous peoples, and global Southern countries around the world and here in the United States are already being disproportionately impacted, both by the virus and also by prevention and treatment measures or lack thereof. And experience from past crises has also shown us that in emergency situations, often the contributions of frontline communities are invisibilized and erased at worst. That the stories of origin, of impact, and of change tend to center dominant voices and dominant powers, as do where and to whom resources flow. So we at Thousand Currents wanted to hold this conversation with you, our community, both old and new, to talk about what's happening in the Global South and how movements are responding to the current moment. This is our first time organizing a webinar like this, and we hope it is the first of several for us and for our sector. Today, to help guide and hold this conversation, we have three of our colleagues who really hold the heart of the work at Thousand Currents to share with us what we are hearing and learning from our partners. We've got Luam Kidana, who is the Director of Africa Programs at Thousand Currents, who's joining us from Cabo Verde. We've got Monica Carrillo Zagara, who is the director of that Latin America program at Thousand Currents, and she's joining us from Philadelphia, even though she's normally based in New York City. And we've got Catherine Zavala, who is the director of Grassroots Partnerships at Thousand Currents, who's joining us from New York City. Catherine is stepping in for today's purposes for Ashlisha Katse, who is our regional program manager for Asia and the Pacific, who's not able to join us because she's in India, and it would be quite unfair to have her on a call at this hour. In terms of structure for today's conversation, I'll ask three questions that our panelists will respond to. And please feel free to pose questions throughout the conversation, as we have a team of people who are ready to support this process. Some of your questions will be answered via the Q&A platform or box at the bottom of your screen, and others I will put forward to our panelists to respond to us in real time. My colleagues Rajiv and Jesse will be fielding and responding to questions in the Q&A box. And we also have Dino, Aisha, and Rachel, who are ready to provide any form of technical support that we may need throughout this webinar. So with that said, why don't I get us started? And let me start by going to you, Luam. Can you talk to us about what we're learning and hearing from our partners in their Africa region about how COVID is impacting them right now. What are their analysis and insights?
Yes, thanks, Salome. So there are a set of overlapping conditions highlighted again by COVID-19, which have made Africa particularly vulnerable to an impending crisis. Firstly, the majority of Africans don't have adequate access to water, food, and healthcare as a result of decades of policies which have pushed for the privatization of public services, which has as a result wiped out public services. For example, we have approximately 403,000 people who die of malaria every year. In Africa, a disease that at this point in time, people shouldn't be dying of because people can't afford treatment or living conditions that reduce the risk of exposure. Additionally, the continued rise in industrialized agriculture across the continent under the guise of the corporate-driven green revolution, which falsely promised increased yields in food production if farmers used chemical pesticides and fertilizers and GMO seeds. What it has managed to do instead is push for a regime of monocropping for export, which has decreased the diversity of foods that African farmers grow, a diversity that is essential both to a healthy and nutritious diet, but also to an ecosystem. Additionally, the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides have also ruined soil, forcing farmers to abandon the lands that they've been on for generations in the hopes that they can find other lands to grow food on. The privatization of land and land grabbing, which has forcibly displaced peoples into densely populated areas, is also another matter of concern in this crisis. And then finally, authoritarianisms and a state that works in the interests of private capital rather than the people that has criminalized communities organizing to change these conditions. So what does this mean then for Africa and COVID-19? It means that the measures being put in place throughout Europe and in some parts of the United States, how do you physically distance when you live in densely populated areas in precarious housing? How do you physically distance when you don't have regular access to water in order to wash your hands frequently, or go to work when you eat what you earn in that day? In this context, then our partners are calling for a variety of things, some of them including that all evictions of people living on settlements must be stopped, that all workers must be paid sick leave, that medical information be made available in all indigenous languages and not just in colonial languages, and that this information not only be disseminated in urban centers, but also in rural communities. They're also calling for communities to be given immediate access to water, electricity, and sanitation, to universal basic income to be guaranteed to people who are unable to work. And I would also include people who work but in areas that are not recognized as work, such as care workers. They're also calling for, in addition to food being made freely available to those who need it, for subsidies and price caps to also be implemented. Additionally, we're holding this conversation on Zoom because of physical distancing measures, and the world has increasingly gone into a more virtual reality. But this isn't accessible to everyone. And so our partners are also calling for data to be provided for free so that there isn't an information gap based on who can afford and who to be connected and who can't. And then finally, everyone also needs to be able to access free testing and treatment, including preventative sanitary products, and that hospitals and medical facilities be made available to all people regardless of migration status. And as a last comment, these demands are not unique to COVID-19. Movements and civil society organizations across Africa have been calling for these measures and more to be instituted with immediate effect for decades. And I think that's a really important point to be holding as we're having these conversations as well.
Thank you for that, Luam. Can I go to you now, Catherine, to talk to us about what we're hearing from partners in Asia and to see the connections with what's happening in Africa and where there may be divergence?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm happy to step in for our program manager for Asia and Pacific. We work in 3 subregions in the Asia Pacific region, South Asia, Pacific Islands, and we started our expansion to Southeast Asia, starting with the Philippines. Building on what Luam said, there's definitely a level of food insecurity that is being felt right now by across all regions. And also, as Tuluam was saying, that the current agro-industrial food system and neoliberal economies in South Asia particularly are really ill-equipped to deal with this crisis. One of the ways that food insecurity is being caused is through the ban of public transportation. And that has had a huge impact in terms of food not being able to be distributed, farmers not being able to sell their foods. There's actual produce that is rotting on the farms right now. Those who have been able to practice localized food systems by growing vegetables and root crops in their gardens have some access to food, but then they're not able to access staples like rice, for example. In the Pacific Islands, the food distribution has been particularly impacted by floodings. Some of you may have heard that the tropical cyclone Harold just hit the Pacific Islands, particularly Vanuatu and Fiji, and that has destroyed a lot of housing and buildings, and particularly the roads that allow food distribution to happen. And there's a level of uncertainty right now whether rebuilding efforts are going to happen because of this moment of COVID-19. The other trend that is also rising is the power of authoritarianism in the region and the aggressive measures that governments are taking. This is particularly seen in the Philippines, where on March 9th, the government stated a national emergency state in the country and deployed military and police right away to guard checkpoints. And also they approved a bill that gave even more power to the Duterte government. The lockdown has not stopped the government from continuing to target and assassinate community leaders, unfortunately. And it's also not stopping extractive industries from taking advantage of the lockdown to take over land. And one case that just happened this past Monday was the mining company Ocean Gold Philippines. They brought 3 diesel trucks escorted by 100 police personnel to disperse a people's barricade in Didipio. And that actually forced people to come out and to protest and try to stop. A lot of them were indigenous women, and the reaction of the police was to just injure and beat them. So these aggressive measures we're also seeing in India as well, and particularly one of the things with the ban of the public transportation has also meant that the estimated of 120 million migrant workers were left stranded and not able to return home. And so what that has meant is that they've had to walk miles, in some cases 800 miles, which takes 10 to 12 days to return home. And because there's a lockdown and they're enforcing it with police brutality, some of these migrant workers are being beaten just by the fact that they're walking, trying to return home. And finally, I just wanted to mention sort of the impact on women that we're seeing in this period. We're hearing from our partners in Fiji that outside of the COVID-19, Fiji actually has one of the highest prevalence rates of violence against women and girls. 64% of women have experienced intimate partner violence in their lives. And our partner Diva for Equality last year actually did a research that took a step further to examine the human rights situation of also LGBTQ and gender nonconforming population. And it found that 83% of women and gender nonconforming folks were experiencing physical violence by intimate partners. So this lockdown, which assumes that staying home is in a home which is recognized as a safe space, is actually not for a lot of women. And some of the social norms, in addition to physical violence, expect women to take on roles that are about unpaid care for children and elders. And if they don't follow these social norms, in some cases, they are actually kicked out of the house. So I think I will end that there for now.
Thank you so much for that, Catherine. Monica, can you talk to us about what we're hearing from partners in Latin America?
Sure. In addition to the risk of death for the pandemic, they are at risk of starvation. And this is one of the most important things that our partners are addressing. I would like to share 5 aspects about how this crisis is affecting our partners. The first aspect is related to the precariousness of the health system. In many rural areas, the communities are isolated and abandoned by the health system. They need at least 3 days to find a hospital. They need to walk 3 days or take a boat to find a hospital. Partners also are talking a lot about what will happen with that 145 uncontacted indigenous communities that are one of the most vulnerable communities in this kind of pandemic. The other aspect is related to the Afro-descendants communities in rural area. According to official data, the prevalent illnesses in Afro-descendants in the Americas are like diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular diseases, which are risk factors, no, that increase the lethality of the virus. So they are asking for specific public policies that can address these differences in the communities. The other aspect is related to water. No, there is no access to running water at home in many countries, but it's important to remember that this is also happening in urban areas, not just in rural areas. For example, in Guatemala and Peru, 25% of the total population don't have running water. In Guatemala, 4 million, and in Peru, 7 million. And in Brazil, around 35 million people don't have running water. So they cannot, of course, follow the procedures or take specific measurements like wash hands, no, because of this situation. And related to women, many women and girls from rural areas, they have 3 main activities. They are working in the farm, they are selling produce, and they are working in domestic service. Just about the domestic service, there are around 14 million domestic workers in Latin America that now maybe they are not having an income or they are forced to work during the lockdown without no protection or respect of their human rights. Related to gender violence is the same than in other regions. For example, in Colombia, there are 79% more reports of gender violence during this lockdown, and 12 women were killed. In Mexico, there are 60% more reports of gender violence. And in Peru, in the first 17 days of quarantine, 27 women reported sexual violence and 17 were children. The other aspect is related to elders. You know, we know that elders are the most affected group. Many elders in rural areas, they are in share of the grandchildren, no? Because the sons or the daughters are working abroad, are working in the capital, or they are working in another country. So now they don't have the remesas or the remittances, so they don't can feed themselves or feed the grandchildren anymore. And the last aspect that I would like to address is related to security and expropriation of land. This lockdown is forcing leaders to be at home. Usually many of the defenders of human rights, they are not staying in their same home for a while. No, they need to move a lot in order to protect themselves. But now they are an easy target. In Colombia, during this lockdown, 5 leaders, for example, they were killed. And the other aspect is related to the governments, that the governments are using this situation of emergency to give indigenous land to extractive companies, arguing that these companies will guarantee to reduce the upcoming recession. Yeah, this is some of the ways in which the COVID-19 is affecting our partners in Latin America.
Thank you for that. Thank you to all of you for sharing partner insights and experiences, and for sharing how they're impacted directly by COVID, right? Its impact on health, its impact on safety, the need for information, the need for healthcare, and the fact that those who are already outside the margins of power are feeling the brunt of its impact. But you've also touched on its related systemic impact, right? And how it's already worsening existing systems that partners are trying to transform, be it food, be it issues around land or economic opportunities. Luong, can you talk to us about how partners are responding directly to COVID, as well as in relation to their long-term strategies?
Yeah, definitely. So we have an ecosystem of partners in the Africa program. We have movements, we have organizations, and we also have research institutions. And so our partners are then taking varied approaches to the situation that are facing their communities. One example is that the African Center for Biodiversity and the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa are a part of a coalition of trade unions, civic organizations, organization of informal workers, faith-based organizations, community structures, and individuals in South Africa that have self-organized to compile a database comprised of small food producers, food distributors, and community contact points in vulnerable communities, in this case, informal settlements, townships, and inner cities, where formal programs often do not reach to ensure that people are getting food. Through a volunteer network that will work off of the information from that database, the objective is to facilitate procurement and distribution of food, specifically focusing on vulnerable communities. And so the idea with this particular initiative that's in direct response to the situation in South Africa is to both ensure that food is reaching poor and working class Africans, and also to ensure that small scale farmers who usually sell their foods at community markets that are now closed have a way to distribute their surplus food so that it doesn't just rot on their farms. Whereas other partners like Nous Sommes la Solution, which works across West Africa, Health of Mother Earth Foundation, which is working in Nigeria and South Sudan, and the Zimbabwe Smallholder Organic Farmers Forum continue to focus on political education by producing research and communications materials on why agroecology is a climate solution, which is important in its own right, but it's particularly important in this moment as more and more research is coming out, which is pointing to how industrialized agriculture is increasing the chances that pandemics like COVID-19 will continue to happen and continue to happen at an increased rate. And then the last example I'll give is that members in Abakhlali, which is a movement of shack dwellers in South Africa, are continuing to face evictions through increasingly militarized mechanisms, despite a national lockdown being in place. And so in response to this, Abakhlali has been using tactics of direct action, coalition building, and strategic litigation to resist evictions and to continue to fight for their right to land and a life of dignity as well.
Thanks for that, Noam. Monica, can I come to you now to talk to us about how partners in Latin America are responding?
Sure. Some partners are demanding the governments to recognize farmers as essential workers. Now, right now, in many countries, there is not necessarily a shortage of supplies now, but that shortage will consume if farmers are not considered as essential workers, because now in many areas they are not allowed to work. Also, some farmers are demanding the implementation of family farming policies to combat the imminent hunger. Now in Guatemala, for example, some organizations are reporting that people are just eating beans and corn. Now they are deciding to create a system where they can exchange grains for vegetables as a way to balance their diet. A big economic crisis is expected after this pandemic. And for some organizations, this could be a good opportunity for those who migrate to return to their lands if there are public policies to support food sovereignty. The other example is that in countries like Peru, some organizations and communities are using community patrols to reduce the presence of military and police. These groups are made up by members of the community. Another example, for example, in Guatemala and Peru, our partners are organizing elders and single mothers and placing them in houses of other members of the community. So this is a way how they can provide food to everybody. In all the cases, our partners are moving their offices or workspace to their homes, which requires them to pay for internet services, buying computers, and have better security protocols. Another example is that in some areas like Guatemala, Mexico, and Peru, and Brazil, they are reactivating this idea of olla común, like communal pot, where everybody can cook collectively. So they are establishing some strategies, since people cannot cook together, but at least one family or one organization is in share of one part of the meal, maybe to cook the rice, another group is cooking the beans, and they are establishing strategies about how they can share right now the food. And the last example is more related to child workers. No, we need to remember that in Latin America, there are around 15 million of child workers, and they are providing around 30% of the family income in some countries like Brazil. In countries like Bolivia, 65% of the child labor is in rural areas, but not all the children are living under the protection of parents. So there are some organizations of girls and boys that they are organizing themselves to secure them some basic food. They are not going to receive a check from the government, no, like many unemployed people. So what will happen with them? So this is one of the things that some groups are discussing, especially organization of children and teenagers, girls and boys in Latin America. Yeah, this is some of the ways in which our partners are responding.
Thank you, Monica. Catherine, can you talk to us about how partners are responding in Asia and the Pacific?
Yes. So one of the ways that our partners have been responding has also been about building awareness campaigns, because one of the things that tends to happen is the government doesn't actually go to the remote rural areas to share information or even accurate information around about the COVID-19 and the ways to protect yourself. So that is something that we've seen our partners, particularly in the Pacific Islands, building awareness campaigns in different languages, indigenous languages. And one of the ways Diva for Equality has been really creative is to have a hand washing challenge via YouTube. And that is a way to sort of promote folks to share how they are washing their hands for 20 seconds, and a way to sort of encourage people to actually do that. Also, a partner in Nepal, Waken, is also reaching out to the women in the remote areas because they've seen that they are not aware at all about the COVID-19 and needing to sort of give them the basic information so they can start protecting themselves. And then very similarly, we're also seeing farmers organizing, particularly in South Asia. The barter system has kind of come back to be a solution for especially those that don't have cash at the moment. We've seen this particularly in Karnataka state in India, where they've been trading food grains, millets, vegetables, milk, and milk products with each other. And they've spread the word, so now there's about 400 villages that are actually practicing the barter system. We're also seeing peasant farmer movements distributing food rations and to laborers across South Asia. And then lastly, very similarly to what others have mentioned, they're taking this moment to really share the analysis around how they got to where they are and why their system is set up in a way that is not going to be able to deal with COVID-19 adequately. And a lot of these conditions come from the legacy of imperialism, of post-colonial exploitation in the last decades of neoliberal capitalism that have set up the system as such, particularly with the role of international financial institutions like the World Bank and IMF, who have put these countries in debt and asking them to remove their resources away from investing in social and needs such as health and housing, and opening more for privatization and allowing for more foreign direct investment. So there's also the need to sort of share that the solutions will come from the grassroots, and it's very important to invest in those types of solutions and systems that are being built by the people below.
Thank you for that, Catherine. And while I have you, I would love to ask you a question from our participants. Margaret is asking if we can explain a bit about the process of collecting this data or information from our partners. Were there any challenges in collecting the information, and how did you address them? So if you can get us started, Catherine, and then if Monica and Loam, if you're able to contribute to that as well, that would be great.
Yeah, so as soon as we were following the spread of the COVID-19, we knew at Thousand Currents that this was going to reach our partners, and we needed to start having the conversations around the ways that we can support our partners and checking in with them to see how they were feeling and sort of starting to respond to this pandemic. And because of our nature of having long-term relationships with our partners, all of the regional staff have relationships and do regular correspondence. So there was an intention of sort of checking in, and just with that, we started to collect information. We're seeing now with every day that in some cases it's getting a little bit more challenging to communicate as people are switching to online platforms, or actually don't have as much access to internet, so they're using mobile phones more frequently. So we're just trying to collect things as they are able to inform us, and we're tracking as closely as we can and sort of figuring out how we want to respond.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Luam and Monica, do you have anything to add? If not, I can go to the next question. All right. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. We have another question from Paul. Hi, Paul, who is the founder of Thousand Currents. And the question is, has Thousand Currents changed its priorities or forms of support to partners in response to the pandemic? Catherine, you want to answer that?
Yes. Well, we haven't actually changed our priorities. Our priority has always been what is the best effective way to support grassroots groups and social movements. And we've been clear from a very long time that providing general core long-term support is something that really helps grassroots groups and social movements advance their work in general. And it's in moments of crisis where they're able to have the flexibility to adjust with those kinds of funds to really address the needs in the moment. So that hasn't actually changed. What we're trying to do is figure out to expand ourselves and see in what other ways we're able to support and think about what are the things that we can share with the philanthropic sector. So some of the things that have come up recently is a need for more technical support and kind of giving some information around what are some of the online platforms that partners can use, given that they have to now work from home. And then we're just, we've been interested in sort of giving emergency grants as soon as possible, because we know that even though the needs, the impact are happening at different levels, we all know everyone's going to need support. So we're just focusing on that in this moment.
Thanks for that, Catherine. All of you have talked to us about all the ways in which partners are responding, be it responding to the immediate needs, like the needs for health and healthcare, the needs for housing, the need for quality and accurate information about this pandemic. You've talked to us about how partners are engaging in direct action and continuing to organize in this moment. You've talked to us about how partners are using this as an opportunity to reconsider and reform some policies that Monica touched on, to reinitiate and strengthen mutual aid practices. And you've talked to us about how they're building awareness and how in some ways they're returning to old systems, right? Like the barter system. So partners are going to the past and drawing ideas and practices from there that can help us address the present reality, and also really thinking about how we can use this as an opening to build new futures for us. From the side of funders like us, I want to talk to you now about what do funders need to know and how can funders show up and enact solidarity with partners in this moment. And I'll start with you, Luam. I'd love for you to respond to this question. And you also have a question from our participants about how can people who are interested in learning more about the community-led organizations throughout Africa, including the coalition that you mentioned, which I believe was Abalali, how can someone connect with them?
Yeah, thanks, Salome. I think maybe to start with the question of whether Thousand Currents has shifted its priorities or ways of working, I just to reiterate what Catherine was saying, it's not that we've shifted our ways of working, we're just deepening them. The main way that we support movements is through funding. And our funding practice is that we move funds that are core, flexible, and longer term. And this has always been important, but it's even more important now. And the reason for that is because core funding, flexible funding, and longer term funding gives grassroots groups the flexibility to respond to emerging situations rather than being stuck into a project grant or project outcomes that no longer are relevant to the work of their communities. And so I think that's really important to stress in terms of the continued responses to COVID-19. And to also understand that COVID-19 is part of a systemic failure and systemic failures. And so in addition to supporting emergency responses to COVID-19, it's also really important to be continuing to fund movements that are working for economic justice, for climate justice, and for food sovereignty, because it's those movements who are doing the structural work to prevent these types of crises from happening. And so I know within philanthropy, we can sometimes be led by an impulse to just fund one thing because that's the thing that's clearing our headlines and that's the only thing we're seeing in our news cycles. And while the immediate emergency responses are absolutely necessary, it's also important to take a holistic approach to the ways in which we're moving money at this point. So the idea here is to really deepen the practices of core, flexible, and longer term funding. I think in addition, it's also even more important now to deepen support to grassroots groups, which is what Catherine had begun to mention, because in addition to them fighting for systemic change and change for the longer term, what we've learned from other epidemics like the Ebola outbreak that happened in West Africa from 2014 to 2016 is that the most effective containment and education tactics came from community-based institutions and responses, not from international NGOs, not from multilateral and bilateral institutions. And then additionally, I think another really important point to highlight here and to nuance the conversation is that it's also increasingly important to be funding grassroots women's and feminist organizing at this point, because women and other oppressed genders are at the forefront of these types of crises. And so that, I think, is a really important point to highlight in this conversation as well. We need holistic approaches. I think also to talk about a point brought up earlier around how have we been gathering this data from our partners and how have we been responding when there's been difficulty. We have really flexible methods of communication with our partners, not just in this particular moment, but just generally speaking, to address their own security needs and concerns, but also just where they are and whether they have access to the internet or not, or connection. And so we have a variety of different ways that we continue to be in contact with our partners so that when emergency situations come up, we're not scrambling. So what we're trying to do is create multiple entry points for communication that try to plan ahead for these types of conversations and make sure that we have flexible ways of communicating with our partners. So this might include things like using Signal as a communication method and sending documents over that if there are partners who are under surveillance or have security threats. It might mean calling partners on their phone instead of asking them to log into a Zoom webinar or onto an internet-based phone call. But at the heart of it, I think the most important thing is to ask the people that you're working with and the communities that you're working with what is best for them, and they'll let you know. And they're experts at their own conditions and their circumstances.
Thank you for that, Luam. Catherine, would you like to respond to that question about how can funders respond and what do funders need to do in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, building on what Luam was saying, there isn't really, what we're seeing is that there isn't really one way to respond to this pandemic because the context for every partner is different. So it's really important to sort of recognize the diversity of the responses and to support all of them because they're all addressing local conditions. And that, yes, that the communities are usually the first and the most effective responders in times of crisis. So it's very important to have that on the forefront of your fundraising strategy. There's a tendency to sort of want to go to large scale responses and maybe support through governments and bigger institutions. But over time, we've seen with the Nepal earthquake disaster and with hurricanes disasters in Central America, it's really the communities who are the first ones to sort of activate their support systems for the communities and address the needs and are there for the well-being of everyone.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Monica, would you like to add to this?
Sure. in addition to the ideas that Luan and Catherine shared, I just want to address that it's important to support grassroots organization and local initiatives, and also to have an intersectional perspective, no, that can identify the differences of race, ethnicity, and gender identity. So it's important to remember that even among impoverished and rural communities, there are structures of discrimination that privilege some groups among others, no? Men over women, binary gender identity over queer identity, what is happening with people living with HIV in rural areas. So it is important to make an effort and to be sure that the resources are reaching those who are the most disadvantaged. So our partners were in these communities before the crisis start. So it's important that we can work with them because they can reach places that the government cannot. For example, one of our partners, the network of women in Peru, they are 521 women, 92% speak indigenous language, and they are monolingual, so they don't speak Spanish. So the only way how really, they think that the only way how they really can educate people and just design ideas about how they can protect themselves in this context is making information or providing information in their indigenous language and doing this outreach that the government is not doing. No? I think this is one of the ideas about this.
Thank you for that point, Monica. We have a question from Isabella on what should international NGOs be doing to support grassroots groups, and how can we understand our human needs better? Will you get us started, Luan?
Sure. I think there's a couple of ways to think about the question around international NGOs. I think the short answer and the more direct answer is that international NGOs should be moving funds that they have directly to movements in the countries that they're working on, because they're better placed to be responding to the multiple crises that are happening at one time. COVID-19 just happens to be the one thing that we're all listening to on the news cycles right now. But I think in terms of a longer form answer, I think the question that we need to be asking is, why is it that money is moving to international NGOs and not to movements? And so that, of course, is a longer conversation, but something that we really need to take into consideration when we think that, when we know that what shifts situations in people's lives is not policies, but power, and power comes from the people, from a power from below. And so I think in a more nuanced answer to that question, if we're thinking about why is it that money is moving in particular ways and what can we do in the different institutions that we're in, there's a framing that Michael Edwards has termed an ecosystem of funders. And so one way that you can start to think of it is, where do you sit in that ecosystem of funders? Are you working in a bilateral and multilateral organization? Are you situated in a large foundation, or do you work for a smaller foundation or an intermediary? If you work for a bilateral, for instance, then yes, moving funds directly to movements and grassroots groups will likely be difficult, but then you could move those funds to national NGOs, which work more closely with movements. If you're a large foundation, could you move to intermediaries who have staff in the contexts and regions that can move funds faster and more directly to movements than you can? Or if you're part of a smaller foundation or individuals that move funds directly to movements, can you do it within a shorter turnaround with less bureaucracy and less reporting requirements? And so as you can see, depending on where you are in this ecosystem, there are strategic ways to get to the funding flows. And that, I think, is something maybe that we can grapple with in future conversations. And I should say that this isn't me saying that all of us in the room are off the hook. We still need to shift the types of practices in each of our institutions that aren't allowing for us to move funds directly to movements.
Great, thank you for that response, Luan. Catherine, is there anything you would want to add to that? I'm happy to move us to the next question otherwise. Go ahead.
Maybe something just to build on and also to respond also in the ways that funders can be responding is to also not think of this moment as the moment to be doing general core support and investing in movements, but this to really go beyond this moment and think about this as a medium long-term process where we want to continually to practice that and figure out the ways that we can continue to support movements and grassroots communities that are able to respond and also able to build alternatives to the system that is not currently working for us.
Thank you. I want to ask another question from our audience about what opportunities do partners see for advancing systemic economic change in light of the inequities laid bare by the crisis? So how are partners seeing this as an opportunity to build a different type of world or a different type of future than the one that we have right now? Have you heard any insights or analysis from partners about that? Can I go to you, Monica, to get us started on that?
Yes, sure. Maybe I can share, it's maybe something that I already mentioned, that some organizations are trying to use this opportunity to talk to the governments, to do political advocacy, to be recognized as essential workers. So farmers should be recognized as essential workers. So that can really shift a lot the relationship that farmers movement has with many governments. Also the idea that in this context, the urban area, they're really a very dangerous place to stay because there is a lot of congestion. There are many people living in informal settlements or living in buildings. So many organizations, they are seeing this as an opportunity to invite people to come back to the farm. Many people that they migrate many years ago, escaping from the rural areas, trying to look for better opportunities. Maybe now this is the opportunity where they really can come back home and help them to create a new system. And also for many partners, that could be possible if there is a lot of public policies that can support the family agriculture, no? That can support the local initiatives and the agroecological ideas, no? Because otherwise there won't be possible to sustain the new migration from the urban areas to the rural area if there is no food in the rural areas. Yeah, this is one thing that I can share.
Thank you for that, Monica. Catherine, we have a question about what is the most important value that you are practicing when you engage with partners right now?
Oh, wow. There's many values. I think, definitely the principle of solidarity is very important in the way that how do we show up in this moment, particularly as our role as funders. We are also about what are the ways to get creative in the ways that we want to communicate. And also as we're seeing maybe potentially banks closing down, we want to see what ways that we can expand the way that we're doing grant making. So there's the value of just being, just continuing to be open and creative in the ways that we want to respond. Yeah, and creative collaboration. So we're trying to also figure out how others are sort of responding and see if there's a way that we can connect with each other. And continuing the deep value of listening with our partners so that we're always kind of there to sort of hear their needs and again, to just respond as funders to be able to meet those needs.
Thanks, Catherine. Norm, would you like to add to a value that you're holding right now?
I think similar to what Catherine has said, it's that movements and grassroots communities and people living the day-to-day reality are the ones who hold the knowledge and the expertise. And as funders, if we continue asking questions and listening and holding core that we need to move money as fast as possible with the least amount of bureaucracy as possible at the core of what's leading our work, then I think we'll continue to be acting in solidarity with movements in the global south. And I think in part, it's also important to hold that philanthropy is not politically neutral. There's a reason that there's money held in the global north and not in the global south, that communities are impoverished. And within philanthropy, we need to reckon with that political question of how are we complacent? And what is it that we need to do in order to really radically redistribute resources? And so that's something that we're always in conversation with our partners around and figuring out what it is that we can do to continue to be in solidarity.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Luan. We have about 7 minutes left and many more questions that we can answer right now. So we just wanted to tell our participants that we are going to collect the questions and respond to them and get back to you through our follow-up processes. For now, to just kind of send us out of this conversation, I would love for each of you, and I'll start with Monica, to answer a question from an audience, which was, how can we in the United States learn from grassroots movements in the global south and about how to create community resilience?
I think that the community resilience is something very important for us. And for example, something that I can analyze is that in many countries in Latin America, we have the idea of the extended family. No, this is something very important. It's your cousin, your uncle, but also the cousin of the cousin or the uncle of the uncle. Just the idea that we are together, and how now people, for example, are creating this kind of strategies of organizing all the elders and placing them in different houses, as a family. That aspect is something really important that I guess in the US and in many countries, people, they cannot practice this kind of strategies because the internal migration or just the individualisms. I guess that idea of the collective family or extended family is something that we can learn. Also, I think that the idea of protecting and supporting elders. In this crisis, we hear a lot of comments related to, oh, this crisis is just affecting elders and no young people, so you don't need to be worried because you are not old. But I guess that everybody, at least many of us, we love our parents or our grandparents. So it's really important to see that there are many initiatives in Latin America, for example, where people are supporting elders and trying to put them as a priority, of this crisis, how we can design strategies to protect them. Yeah, I think there are two things that I can share now.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Monica. Catherine, can you build on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've learned for a long time is the need for food sovereignty and agroecology as the food systems that we need for everyone to be fed and to be in harmony with Mother Earth. So I think as we're seeing one of our partners, La Via Campesina, who has this slogan right now around something around like staying safe, but don't stay quiet, or don't stay silent, because this is a moment to sort of uplift the way that industrial agricultural system is just not the food system that is really going to take care of us in any time or in moments of crisis. And the other thing that I feel like that we were learning from our partners, and we just heard a really beautiful sort of suggestion from our partner in Chiapas, Mexico, who work very closely with the Zapatistas, that we have to take this moment as a moment to reimagine what our system should look like, to really remember to dream and to continue to work towards that vision.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Indeed, on the point about dreaming. Luam, feel free to respond to that question if there's anything you want to add. I wanted to pose a different question to you in addition to that from our audience, which is, how are movements working collectively with other civil society groups and other movements? Are there cross-movement collaborations that happening right now?
Thanks, Salome. In terms of are there cross-movement, is cross-movement work happening? Yes, definitely, in all of the examples I gave in the African context, but also the ones that Monica and Catherine gave in the other 2 regions we work in. Most of that work is cross-movement work. And I'm conscious that we only have a couple of minutes of time, so we can also follow up via email with some more examples of how this is happening if people are interested in plugging in. I think in terms of the question around how to be in, what to learn from movements in the global South, I think I would also add what to learn from movements that are in the United States as well. I think that that neoliberalism has become a dominant global paradigm. And so one way for us to begin to dismantle that is to fight from where each of us are in. That means supporting your farm workers. That means making sure that people in your communities have universal basic income. It means ensuring that your governments, policymakers aren't instituting and pushing through policies that continue to really disadvantage countries in the global South and communities in the global South. This is going to be a globalized struggle. The problem is not only in the global South, the problem is also in the global North. And it's going to be a collective and global struggle to really to shift the current neoliberal paradigm. But I think to end, the opportunity that we have now is that all of the different contradictions are really being laid to bear. And so it's up to us to seize this moment as people who are interested in social justice, who are committed to seeing a world of equity and justice, to fight from where we are and to make sure that we're doing what we can in our day-to-day.
Thank you for that reminder, Luam. We have about a minute left, so I'm going to wrap us up. I want to thank you, Luam, Monica, and Catherine for sharing the insights, experiences, and perspectives, as well as needs of partners in this critical moment today. And I want to thank each one of you who are on this call. Thank you for joining us. If the data is right, we know that we'll be grappling with this pandemic and its impact for quite some time, quite a bit of time. And as it continues to unfold, we ask and we invite you to continue to keep your eyes and ears on what's happening in the places and to the people who are outside the margins of power and resources wherever you are and around the world. We will continue to keep you informed of opportunities to further engage. If you go to thousandcurrents.org, there are some more resources, information, and blogs that touch on this pandemic and its impact. And as you can imagine, many of us who are working with grassroots group communities, frontline communities, and movements are organizing ourselves right now to be able to better enact solidarity with our partners. As Luam reminded us, this is a North and South issue, and this is a moment for us to seize and for us to really advance what it means to be in solidarity with each other. So for those of you who are able to contribute financially, we've set up a solidarity fund called the Above and Beyond to directly resource grassroots and movement responses to the pandemic. And many of our peers in the sector who are in relationship with grassroots groups and movements are doing the same as well, because as we said, the need is prevalent everywhere. Many thanks again for joining us, despite the tremendous demands on your time and on your heart and on your mind these days. And please be well and stay connected. Thank you.